guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I am going to be sharing with you my best books of 2020 so far. So I'm going to be doing this just a little bit differently because I don't normally do a best books at the mid-year points, but I do track my favourite book from every month when the month is over, so I thought it would be fun to bring you a month by month account of my favourite books of the year. There is going to be one slight exception here because two of the books are from the same series, so instead of just saying my thoughts twice, I have substituted one with just generally one of my favourite books of the year. So getting this video started off with a bang, my favourite book of January, and thus far still my favourite book of 2020 is Crescent City or House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J Maas. You guys know that I'm just like absolute trash for this woman's work, and Crescent City I think is her strongest work so far. I was lucky enough to receive an ARC of this as well, which is how I read it in January, and to celebrate the release of this book I did do a full week of videos which included a non-spoiler review, a spoilery vlog, a music video, and also a guide to all of her work so far. But this is Sarah J Maas's first adult work. It is an adult urban fantasy that follows a woman called Bryce, and Bryce is a party girl. There's a lot of things like recreational drug use in this book, and Bryce is a party girl and her best friend is Danica. Danica is a wolf shifter and her pack serve as the security for Crescent City. So this story really starts off where a man who Danica has previously put into jail is about to be released, and shortly after this there is a cataclysmic event that tips Bryce's world upside down. We then flash forward a couple of years to the bulk of this story where Bryce is pulled in on an investigation by the Archangel who rules all of Crescent City and asked to help investigate a series of murders that are going down. Now if you guys know Sarah J Maas, you do know that she is a fantasy romance author, and the romance in this I absolutely adored. During the course of Bryce's investigation she is assigned a bodyguard in the form of a fallen angel called Hunt Athalar, and at first they absolutely despise each other. Bryce thinks that Hunt is too serious, Hunt thinks that Bryce is a vapid party girl, but throughout the course of investigating these murders things start to heat up, shall we say. So I thought that this book had excellent world building. It is a little bit info dumpy at the beginning, but what I find with Sarah J Maas is that even if she's dumping information on you, it all becomes relevant. Her worlds are really thought out and her politics, and what I've always found with her previous series is that something that you may think is irrelevant or inconsequential in the first book of a series she will actually pull into the last book. I really loved all of the relationships in here and all of the characters. I love Danica, Bryce, Hunt, Rune, Lehaba. Literally all of the characters in here are just so precious, and combined with these great relationships and great friendships we also have a really high stakes end of the world type fantasy plot, which is something else that I love about Sarah J Maas. So I already knew when I read this book that providing that I enjoyed it, providing it was her standard of work, that this would end up being my favorite book of the year. I don't foresee anything changing that, just because aside from the fact that it is an amazing book, I'm very deeply emotionally attached to Sarah J Maas's writing and her characters. My favourite book for February was quite surprising to me, as it was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. Now this is, I want to say a new adult romance, but it's actually more of an adult contemporary, and what I expected from this going into it was that it would be a new adult romance. Now I do really like Colleen Hoover as a writing, because for contemporary romance for me I need it to be a little bit unrealistic, overly angsty, overly dramatic, and Colleen Hoover always delivers on that for me, so that's what I expected going into this book. But this is actually a very poignant and nuanced book that follows a young woman who comes from a history of domestic abuse. When she was growing up, her father abused her mother and she was witness to this multiple times. So we start this book when the main character's father has just died, and she has very conflicting feelings about this because he was her father and she did love him for that, but she also saw the years of abuse that her mother endured. To get a little bit of reprieve, the main character Lily heads up to the top of this skyscraper just so she can admire the view, and while she's there a brain surgeon called Ryle appears on the roof. He's blowing off steam after a particularly hard day at work, and they get talking. So the majority of this book is about Ryle and Lily's relationship. However, there is a secondary love interest in here as well, and also two timelines, because we also see Lily reading through her teenage diaries where she documents her time spent with a young boy called Atlas, who was around and also witnessed some of the abuse that her mother suffered at her father's hands. So very much trigger warnings for domestic abuse in here. But what I really loved about this book is that that it painted to me what felt like a very realistic and nuanced portrayal of what a main character in Lily's various situations throughout this book would think and feel and do. Colleen Hoover, just the way that she's written this book, it really makes you put yourself in Lily's shoes, and when it comes to her making some very difficult decisions, you feel that pain with her, you understand what she's going through, and you have the same conflicting feelings that she does. So I thought that this was extremely well done. It went far above and beyond what I expected from it, and I do think that this story is going to stick with me for a long time. So my favourite books of both March and June are from the same series. My favourite book of March was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, and my favourite book of June was Royal Assassin. So I'm going to kind of just talk about the series as a whole because I liked them in both months for the same reasons. But Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb is the first book in the Farseer trilogy, and this is also the start of a much larger series called The Realm of the Eldlings, which my book club, the Catch Up Book Club, is tackling throughout the majority of 2020. So our main character of this first trilogy is called Fitz, and we start the story when Fitz is 6 years old. Fitz is dropped off at the castle gates by his maternal grandfather, who has now decided that he wants nothing to do with him and wants to send Fitz back to his father. So Fitz gets taken to Bookkeep, which is the seat of the crown, and when he arrives he discovers that his father has been made aware of his arrival, abdicated the throne, and decided to go and live in the countryside. So Fitz is kind of at a lost end here, and he ends up pretty much being raised by the castle stable master. All this begins to change when Fitz starts to get a little bit older, because the king decides that a combination of Fitz's royal blood and him also being a bastard puts him in the perfect position to become the royal assassin. So this is a story about Fitz being trained to be and also becoming an assassin. There are assassinations in here, but I would say that that is definitely not the focus of the story. The thing that I love about this series is that it is a very slow, very atmospheric, first-person perspective coming-of-age fantasy story, and something about that writing style for me I just find incredibly comforting. It's almost like slice of life in fantasy. I enjoy following a character in a fantasy world even when not a lot is happening. This series is also extremely political. We have multiple plot lines running through here. There have been a series of raids assaulting the coast of the country in this book for multiple years that the characters are trying to put an end to, but aside from that there is also a lot going on with the royal family of the castle, a lot of political machinations, a lot of the family members are going against each other constantly, and Fitz is just in the middle of this and having to deal with it all and figuring out where his loyalties lie. I like that he's an unreliable narrator because he's also extremely trustworthy, so you do believe him and everything that he says you are kind of on board for, so the plot twists are really impactful because you just don't think to question Fitz because he has no reason to lie. However, being very trusting himself and also quite young throughout the first two books in this series, he often makes mistakes and just doesn't realize that things are happening, which means that the plot twists do take the reader by surprise as well as him. I would say that the main reason that these two books have ended up as my favorites of both March and June is that I just really enjoy the reading experience of them, the comforting, to me at least, writing style, combined with just the way that Robin Hobb builds this atmosphere. I just find them to be a really immersive, very relaxing and soothing reading experience, even though there's some terrible stuff going on here. So I anticipate that there is a good chance that Assassin's Quest may also make it onto my favorite books by month later in the year. So seeing as I pretty much eliminated my favorite book of June and I don't really have anything to replace it because June was kind of just a decent reading month with some good books but not a lot that really stood out to me, I am going to be talking about two books that I read in April that I absolutely adored and will no doubt be on my favorite books of the year list. The first one of those was the very first book that I read in the month, and that was Fortuna Swan by KJ Sutton. So this is a self-published dark fairy romance that I received for review from the author, and I was very intrigued about the synopsis, which is why I accepted the request. However, I did not anticipate obsessing over this book as much as I do. I think about the plot twists in this book and also the sequel, Restless Slumber, pretty constantly, and it makes my heart hurt, honestly. So I'm not actually sure which one is my favorite book because I do like them both for different reasons. I think that Fortuna Swan has a stronger plot, but I think that Restless Slumber really deepens the relationships between all of the characters and makes everything just hurt a little bit more. So I'm not sure which one I prefer, but for the sake of this video, we'll just talk about about Fortuna Swan. So this is a dark fairy romance that follows a woman called Fortuna who is a nightmare. This is kind of a mix of an urban fantasy and high fantasy setting because Fortuna is from the real world or the human world, but the majority of this book is spent in the Unseelie Court. So Fortuna, being a nightmare, is also the last of her kind, and her power is quite unique because she can sense what other people are scared of when she touches them, and the way that she then uses her ability is to create the illusion that they are experiencing their worst nightmares in their mind. Now, it's a power that she doesn't like using, but she does have it, and that is the kind of supernatural creature that she is. At the start of this novel, her brother is missing. I think he's been missing for about 2 years, and one day Fortuna meets a very powerful fairy man who tells her that he will let her know where her brother is and in fact take her right to him, providing that she marries him. So this sets off a whole chain of events that takes her into the Unseelie Court to rescue her brother, and this book is addictive. First and foremost, you will not be able to stop reading this. It is extremely fast-paced. It's like eating candy, the way you just want to find out more and more what is happening here. I really liked the relationships in here. I really like the dynamic between Fortuna and this powerful fairy man. I love the powerful fairy man who is Collis, and we also actually have multiple love interests in here as well, and I like how particularly 2 of those love interests portray a sense of expectation versus reality. So you have this perfect man who is everybody that a normal sane woman would want, and then you have somebody who's a lot more complex and a lot darker, and I just really love the juxtaposition of this perfect man that Fortuna should want, and then also the man that, even though she won't admit it, she actually does want. As well as that, this was just pretty much everything I've been looking for in a dark fairy romance. I have been delving more into fantasy romance and paranormal romance recently, and I never thought that like an urban fantasy fairy story would do it for me, but this is pretty much everything that I could have wanted. The plot is pretty good. It's not the end of the world high stakes things that I normally prefer, but it definitely adds a sense of dread to the story, and it leaves you to question whether your characters are going to make it out okay or not. Kelsey Sutton as well does not pull punches. This series is going to hurt you, and it's going to hurt you a lot. I do have faith that by the end of the series, this will be a 6-book series, that everything is going to work out okay in the end, but the journey is honestly torturous in the best way. If you don't know this about me, I'm a sucker for a tragedy. All of my favorite movies are incredibly sad at the end, and I really like my romance stories full of angst and longing and obstacles that get in the way of 2 characters that want to be together, and Kelsey just provided everything that I wanted in this book. So my other favorite book of April is currently coming in at my 2nd favorite book of the year so far, and that is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 1st book in the Mistborn trilogy, and this book took me by surprise, and it shouldn't have done because I've read Brandon Sanderson before. He's not a new author to me, although I'd only previously read, I think, 2 of his books, but this takes place in a world where the magic system is reliant on metal. So something called an allomancer can ingest metal, and depending on the type of metal, it manifests in a certain power. Now, we have the people who can just do that with 1 metal, but then there are also the Mistborn, and if you can use more than 1 metal, you can pretty much use them all. And our 2 main characters of this story, Kelsier and Vin, are both Mistborn. Now, Kelsier has just escaped some slave mines that he was sent to by the Dark Ruler, and he has returned to the city to start a rebellion and an uprising to overthrow the Final Empire. Along the way, he meets Vin, who is a young girl from quite a troubled past. She's extremely untrusting of the people around her because of the circumstances of her childhood, and Kelsier pretty much takes her under his wing, tells her that she's a Mistborn because even though she kind of felt her power, she had no idea what it was or what was going on, and he trains her, he introduces her to his friends, and there's a whole found family thing as this ragtag group of underground criminals in this world try to overturn the Final Empire, which has been ruled by the Dark Lord for, I think it's 1,000 years. So the thing that took me by surprise about this is that I always forget how accessible Brandon Sanderson's writing is. If you are not familiar with adult fantasy, you will have no problem reading this book. It isn't dense at all. It is a very modern form of storytelling. The magic system is incredibly complex. However, you do have a guide at the back, and the reader learns the magic system at the same time that Vin does. So Kelsier will take Vin out and say, burn this metal metal, how do you feel? And then he will explain to her what that specific metal does. So everything is kind of handed to the reader that way to get you to grips with the world, and that is pretty much my only criticism of this, but that's coming from somebody who reads adult fantasy quite frequently. And I do have to appreciate how easy Brandon Sanderson makes it for you to get sucked into this world. One of the things that I really loved about this series as well is the fight scenes, and I don't dislike fight scenes like quite a few people do, but they're not my favorites. But in this, they are just so cinematic. It's almost like Star Wars, and the way that the Mistborn use their abilities to fight and the innovative ways that Brandon Sanderson has thought of that these characters can manifest their powers absolutely blew my mind, because I would never have thought of using the powers in that way. Just the choreography of the fight scenes was mind-blowing. I really want to continue this series. They are quite chunky, however, and I'm trying not to fall behind on the Farseer trilogy, but I am ridiculously excited to read the rest of the books in this series and also carry on and read a little bit more Brandon Sanderson, because this just, it blew me away, because not only was it very well written, not only was the magic system amazing, not only did it have a really strong plot, it was also a lot more character driven than I expected it to be, and I got sucked into this world and became emotionally attached to some of the characters. And one of the characters, like, I knew that it wasn't going to go well, and it still really hurt me when everything went badly. So the last book that we're going to be talking about today is my favourite book for May, and that was The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden. This is the second book in the Winternight trilogy, which is an adult fantasy series. It is once again a very slow coming of age atmospheric fantasy, and this is heavily inspired by Russian folklore. I didn't know what to expect going into this because everybody loves this series. The way that this is marketed, it's kind of more, it's not necessarily pushed as literary fiction in bookstores, but it seems to set itself apart from the fantasy. I also knew it had a historical Russian setting, and I'm not always comfortable with historical settings and historical fiction. It's just not my favourite, but I fell in love with this story. So the plot of this series is that we have a young girl called Vasya, and she is from a small town in Russia. The beginning of the first book in this series is a very slow account of her growing up. You get familiar with her family, her nurse, and the fairy tales and folklore of the place that she's from. Now, the equilibrium in that book starts to change when her father decides to remarry, because he feels like Vasya needs a strong female figure in the household, as she is a little bit wild, you know. She likes to run in the woods and she wants to learn to ride a horse, and as a woman in this time she should pretty much be learning needlework and preparing to marry. So her father remarries and brings a woman into the household who is a devout Christian. However, the woman is also sighted, and so is Vasya, and being sighted means that you can see and communicate with the household spirits and the spirits of the forest. Now, because of Vasya and her stepmother's different outlooks, they see these things very different ways, and her stepmother thinks that she's being haunted by demons, where Vasya has grown up with these spirits, knows what they are, knows how to communicate with them, and she knows that they are protecting the people of the town from malevolent spirits. However, when Vasya's stepmother turns up, she also brings a priest with her, and the priest starts to convert the townspeople away from the folklore of their area and towards Christianity, which means that the household and forest spirits are not getting tribute, and they are starting to weaken and fade away and can no longer hold back the malevolent spirits. This book in particular does take place in a different setting from the first book. This one takes place in the city of Moscow mainly, but it still had everything that I just love about this series in general. The first thing is exactly the same as with the Farseer trilogy. I love this type of storytelling, and Catherine Arden has a beautiful writing style that is just very immersive, atmospheric, and romantic. It does also have a pretty strong plot, even though I would say that the plot is not necessarily the strongest point in this series. It is very much the writing and the atmosphere that steals the show, but there's enough of a plot in here that I felt satisfied at the end that something had actually happened, and this one is a little bit more action-packed than the first one as well. However, absolutely 100% without a doubt, my favourite thing about this series is something that I did not expect going into this, and never in a million years did I expect this series to contain the one thing that I love about it the most, and that is the romance. Even if I'd have found out that there was romance in here, I would not have thought, given the nature of the rest of this story, that it would be as compelling and beautiful as it is. The romance in here, I don't want to spoil it for anybody because it just made this series so beautiful for me, but it's underpinned with such longing and pining and a sense of it being just unattainable, and it just really makes me feel. And even though I read quite a bit of romance and fantasy romance and I do get really into it, the sense of longing that I just get from reading about the romance in this book is just chef's kiss. I don't know why I'm fangirling over this one the most. I think it is just because I really did not expect to encounter romance here, but it just absolutely blew me away and I'm really excited. Like with Mistborn, I'm desperate to continue this series. I'm hoping that I can fit in the last book in the next couple of months because I need to know how it all ends, but I'm also a little bit scared as well. So there you have it. Those are my 6 favorite books of the year so far. Am I surprised at what we have here? I guess I'm 100% not surprised by this. I'm also not particularly surprised by this because, like I said, a lot of people love this series. And while I was surprised at how instantly I connected to this series when I actually started to read it, I'm not surprised by Mistborn because this is a lot of people's favorite series of all time. As with Assassin's Apprentice, this is a very high regarded adult fantasy series. So I feel like that kind of makes sense. So the real wild cards that we have here, it ends with Us by Colleen Hoover, which I never would have dreamed would have ended up on this list, and Fortuna Swan by KJ Sossun, which I just did not know what to expect when I accepted the review request for this, and I fell in love with it. So please let me know down in the comments what is your guys' favorite book of the year, and if you've read any of my favorites, let me know what you thought of them and maybe whether they'll be making your favorites list. But that's about it from me today, guys, so please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.